Good evening. Welcome in Pakhuis de Zwijger. My name is Servos and it is Charging the Commons, the second episode. And today we're going to talk about design for collective decision making. We'll use the commons to use becoming, or the topic about becoming, into diving into how it can make decision making smoother and what perspectives there are on different ways of doing that. What different methods are there? We have a wonderful panel here tonight, but also a full house here in Amsterdam in Pakhuis de Zwijger. And of course, people watching from home, apparently from all over the world. So welcome here in Amsterdam and thank you for joining us. For the people here in the audience, you have opportunities from moments throughout the evening to participate and ask your questions and join us with the conversation. For the people at home, yeah, I'm sorry, but that is unfortunately not possible for you. But next time, you're more than welcome here in Amsterdam, in Pakhuis, to continue with us and to join our conversation. As I already said, this is a three-part series, and this is the second episode. The first episode is already on YouTube and on deswijger.nl, where you can see the topic about how to turn ideas into actual setting up commons, the so-called becoming, and which steps and actions should be taken in this very early stage. Today, as I said, we're going to talk about how to design for collective decision making, and what different processes are there, and how you can choose between that. And of course, my question is, how would you do that, and why would you do that? And the third episode will be on platform for commons. How can digital technologies support these commons? Tonight is a collaboration between Pakhuis de Zwijger on one side and lots of other partners with the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences and Avans University of Applied Sciences as one of these partners, and the other are just on the screen. And I'm here at the table with four wonderful people. Tara Karpinski, you're a researcher at CARAT and from the Avans University of Applied Sciences. And CARAT stands for Research on Center of Applied Research for Art, Design and Technology. That's much better than the shortened form. Also on table is Martijn Pol. You're co-founder of Space and Matter. At the table next to me is Steven Hennis, process coordinator and resident at the Housing Corporation De Warren here in Amsterdam. And next to you, and also on the table, is Razanel Savo, and you're a community organizer at the CLT H-buurt in Amsterdam Zuidoost, which is also here in Amsterdam. And CLT stands for Community Land Trust. We talk about it all, but please have a warm round of applause for these wonderful people. And Tara, to start with you, you're a researcher at the Center of Applied Research for Art, Design and Technology. That is a mouthful, but what is your ordinary job? What do you do? What do you research?
Good question. Well, for CARAT, I'm part of a lectoraat, a research group that's called Situated Art and Design. Yeah. The way to design, or the way to explain situated design most simply is what we emphasize is that the user, in this case commoners, and the user context of the commons are inextricably intertwined with each other. So if you want to study something, in this case, if we want to study people who are in the commoning process, or more specifically in the becommoning process, we need to become and investigate those environments. So my role in this project was actually to go to the locations. We looked at 3 different locations and spend time there with these communities and conduct research from the inside out.
Yeah. And in the broader topic of today, of course, is the becoming and the charge in the commons. So why is it so important to talk about specifically the decision-making process, where you talk about becoming, which means how to become a common? And then at first we start how to start that, and we end with what technologies could support that. But why should we talk about the decision-making processes within these commons right now?
Yeah, the way our research project is formulated is actually a little bit backwards from the way you just stated it. What we want to look at in this project over the course of 2 years is the role of digital tools and platforms and digital technologies, and how these can be used and incorporated into resource communities. So what we zoomed in on this time around, this is a follow-up from a previous research called Circulate, which we also discussed here, is the becommoning process. So we talk about the initiation of the commons.
Yes.
And during this, what you could also call setting up process, we see that early on, a lot of critical decisions need to be taken.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, we're looking at what kinds of decision-making processes are appropriate here for different communities. But we're also looking at the role of digital technologies that can either support or transform these decision-making situations.
Yeah. And if you start with the beginning, how would you define, in the context of commons, or the group of people need to work together, how would you define the decision-making process? So, could you explain that?
Yeah, well, I think on a practical level, lots of different kinds of decisions have to be made. A very basic one is, for instance, who's in the commons, so who's part of the commons and who's outside of the commons.
So who gets to say and who doesn't get to say.
Yeah, exactly. We call that defining the borders of the commons. What we see here with co-living situations in Amsterdam, for instance, is that in order to apply for a plot, because we have a scarcity of land in Amsterdam, you need to explain as a commons community what type of governance you will implement while you're actually living there. So this is another kind of very practical decision that needs to be made early on in the organization process.
So that goes further than like a foundation or a collaboration, but also a stichting of a vereniging? Or is it more complex than that?
Well, there are different forms to, that we see in terms of different communities. What loosely defined, we're looking at this project, are people that share or groups that share resources. And what we're talking about on the table tonight are co-living situations. Yeah. So both de Waren and the H-buurt are groups of people that will eventually, you guys are already doing it, and will share a house.
Yeah, so it's a way of collaborating together. And then, of course, we go to the commons. And for most people here know that, but still it is good to define the concept of commons. So the commons is a way of sharing resources with a group of people on a sharing basis, not per se a commercial basis or a governmental basis. Is that a
Yeah, I think
looking
that's
at your face, I think you have a better...
I'm looking a bit at the clock. I think that's a good definition for tonight.
Okay, perfect. And so how, if we have this, how would a commons help in creating a co-living situation? Because commons are kind of new, and at the same time they're not. But there were collaborative living, shared living spaces in the 1960s without this concept. So how does what does it add to working or living together like this?
Yeah, I think those spaces and those concepts have been around throughout history in different forms. What we see now is also in correlation with, I think, the desire to be part of a less individualistic society. So people are coming together, they want to share things, also to share things because we need to do that for, very broad reasons, like climate could be one of them. But what underlies all of these communities is a very strong common good or a shared value. And I think that that's the basic building block of what it takes to be able to undergo this whole process together. Because it is a very laborious, time-consuming process.
To live together and to work together and to decide together.
Yeah, especially even to get to the point of realizing a house. I mean, you guys went through this with de Waren as well, and with other communities like Schoonschip, I think we're talking about a period of 10 years. So it's a lange adem, as you say in Dutch.
So with long breath, it's hard to translate this. Yeah. But if you look at Stefan, Rosemel, and Martijn, they're all examples of different ways of bringing people together and deciding on common goods.
Yeah.
So that's the reason why you chose them.
Well, the reason practically why we speak to Stefan tonight and Rosemel is because they've been a big part of our research from the beginning. So these were locations that we spent time at and also with the community, and we followed them in the CLT. In the H-buurt, we're still following them. So they're the processes that we're most familiar with. On the other hand, I think that both communities have followed a very different path and have a different organizational structure towards the realization of their own unique form of commoning. Yeah.
And you talked about situated design. Could you explain that a bit more? So how do you look at situated design? Could you explain that?
My role as a situated designer is basically being there. So
it's in a literal sense, you're situated come from your being in the surroundings, being in your field of research.
Yeah, I mean, without going into too much discourse about different design approaches, I think situated design has also evolved from human-centered design in which, you know, the main principle is saying like, okay, the context in which these things are happening is actually inextricably linked to the people that are using them. And in that sense, the most righteous execution can be done in situ.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's from a discourse perspective. What's more important here on the table tonight, because I think we'll talk about how we got to some of these things that we designed, is that the way we got there is by watching what was happening in the communities and sort of studying and in some senses even being part of the processes in order to realize these commons goals.
Yeah, take us along if you want to explain a bit. Or shall we go to the different examples at the table?
No, I think it's better to talk about the actual examples.
Let's do that then. Then we continue with the different speakers here today. And I'll start with you, Steven. As I said, you are a process coordinator and resident at the housing cooperative De Warren, which is on H-buurt here in Amsterdam. And H-buurt is a new length building process in the eastern part of the city. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a bit about De Warren?
Yeah, sure. So De Warren is basically a self-organized housing cooperative, which means that we are an association that has borrowed money mostly from a German bank and some other funds to realize our own building with 36 rental flats in very different sizes. So we have the smaller apartments without an own kitchen and bathroom, ranging up to family apartments that have 3 bedrooms and their own kitchen and bathroom. But the whole idea of De Warren is that we try to approach everything as a community. And you can see that in the way that we organize ourselves, that we organize events, and in the way that our building is organized, because 33% of what we build is communal.
Perhaps we can show, for the people at home, we can share the pictures.
Yes.
So lots of pictures came by from De Warren. So the difference between like an apartment complex versus collaborative living is that in your case, you actually live together and you have different apartments, of course, where you are situated yourself with address and everything that comes with that. But you share lots more of your life, but also share lots more of responsibility for the building itself.
Yes. Yeah. So we actually, as an association, we own the building.
Yeah.
So we also do maintenance and everything that a commercial builder would also do.
Then what's the difference between then your process and then a homeowners association or VVE?
Yeah, I would say there are similarities, but we own and maintain a whole apartment complex. Yeah. So I guess we have different discussions, and also because we do try to live together. So every floor is its own smaller community. So in total, we are about 50 adults, 5 children at the moment, many coming. And every floor that ranges from 7 people up to 14 people is their own community, has their own communal kitchen, cooks together on a regular basis. And then we have these communal spaces like a theater room or a music studio that we all share as a bigger group.
So the main difference is you're actually the way you're living together, far more focused on interacting with each other, and therefore also far more focused on sharing responsibility in a broader context. You said that you chose a holacracy as a decentralized management structure. And I have some ideas what that could mean, holacracy. It's like democracy, holistic. Could you explain that? So what is a holistic or a holacracy as a decentralized management structure?
Yeah, so if we look at the word, holos means circle, and it's all built organically from circles, basically. So the way that it's managed, it's a little bit more ground up. So everybody has their own specific role in the system and tries to perform that role as best as they can. And they form little groups around themes they find interesting.
Yeah.
So we have a little circle that is about maybe all the plants in the building and outside the building, or another group that forms around organizing events. And thereby you do what is closest and nearest to you, and you bear responsibility for executing those tasks. So it's very self-organized again. Yeah. It's really based on you and what you want to contribute to the community. And it has these very clear-cut roles and purposes, etc. So you asked the difference, for example, with the democratic system.
Yeah.
I would say the biggest difference there lies in how you make decisions together, right? Because holacracy is way more than just a decision-making tool. It's actually a way to organize your community and organize action. And
so it's also very much about trust and everybody is involved with maintaining the whole complex and maintaining the whole system.
There's a very strong sense of ownership, and you don't just go to a meeting and you vote and somebody else executes that, or you decide how to execute it after. No, you speak from a very clear role that you have in the community. And voting doesn't really happen. You can discuss, but in the end, it's really based on trust. And only if there's very strong objections against an idea will be stopped. Yeah. Usually it's built on a measure of trust, and you just go with it as long as it doesn't do damage to the community, basically. And that is what holacracy is about. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. Sarah, so you walked along with them and did your research also at De Warre. What did you look at with De Warre? Why do you think this is a special example of collective decision making?
Yeah, in the beginning of the project, we visited a couple of times before the house was realized, and I think that you guys were actually practicing holacracy in those moments, which was also new for me. I don't know. I mean, I think it's special. I think it's also one of the options, and it's something that really works itself out in process. So that practicing seems really important, and I think you guys noticed that as well, to really work up to the actual doing it. And one of the things that I'm also really curious about, because we haven't seen each other for a while, is how is it working out? Yeah.
So practicing is key. At a certain point, we decided to use holacracy as our system, but it was more confident. We're going to try it for 1 year and see how far it is. Well, tomorrow is actually the 1 year anniversary of De Warre. We'll be living there for a year. And I can say it's going pretty well.
So everybody, you continue with the holacracy as a business, as an operating model.
Yeah, I would say definitely for another while we'll try to implement it as good as we can, because it has all these very complicated procedures, holacracy. But once you get the hang of it, it's actually quite practical, and that's what we really like about it.
Do you need to be a group of friends for this to work?
Holacracy was developed mostly for companies. So a lot of ICT companies started doing this, and we are actually a little bit of the odd one out, because there aren't many more friend groups or living groups actually doing this. So we had to sort of invent, how does this very pragmatic and sometimes dry process work for a group of people that have also a lot of emotional things to discuss. And because decision making obviously isn't only about sort of the practical nature of things. Yeah.
A final question before, and of course we come back to you loads, but final question in this round is, how did you start with this structure? So how did you came up of using this way of decision making?
So we actually, already before we moved in, started a group called Social Architecture, and it was sort of a working group. And as a group, we really researched different ways of decision making. And there's one very passionate person about holacracy in our group called Ellen Maassen. She's actually a holacracy coach right now. Like she was so inspired. She took it to a professional level, and she really guided us through the whole process. So we decided to trust her first, and then slowly build trust with the system. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing this, and thank you for being here to talk with us about how you could use this and what lessons you can get from this process and the things you've learned. We continue with Rosemel Safa. You're a community organizer at the Community Land Trust H-buurt, and H-buurt, neighborhood would be the translation into English, but we're not going to do that because the H-buurt, it's the neighborhood in Amsterdam Zuidoost, so the southeastern part of the city, with lots of streets starting with an H, and that's why it's named like that. Yeah. But we're not here because of that. We're here because you are a community organization with the Community Land Trust. So start with the beginning. What is a community land trust?
I think in general, something we can use. It's basically a housing, let me not say a housing company, a community organization with the main goal of being a long-term steward of affordable housing, specifically for H-buurt, which was founded actually in 2020. Yeah. It took years of community building to arrive at this process, but with us, as somebody who has not necessarily been living in H-buurt, but having been working in H-buurt for such a long time, we thought about ways to which we can have residents have access to community buildings and community developments that are currently occurring a lot in Amsterdam Southeast and specifically in the H-buurt. And this is in such a way, and the main how do I say, prerogative is in as much as possible to also preserve the existing culture and diversity in the neighborhood that we have. We see a lot of gentrification occurring now, especially in our neighborhood. If you go towards the IKEA area and the new developments that are coming, and H-buurt and Belma as a whole has over hundreds of different cultures that we feel still needs to be preserved in the neighborhood. But what we see is a lot of new developments that are rather, for the lack of a better term, sucking the residents of H-buurt out of their
pushing
community.
the current inhabitants out of the neighborhood, and you're there
Exactly.
with using the community land trust. You can try to create something where people can stay
Exactly,
keep
and
their own
have a sense of ownership with regards to the land that they've been in and are involved in almost all their lives.
Is it then bigger than like a living cooperative or a housing cooperative?
I believe it is. It is
Yeah?
very much bigger. We're still in the operation process, but there are many ways of establishing a CLT, and we went towards the direction of creating a one co-op. But the difference, I believe, with different one co-ops as compared to us is our link with the community.
Yeah, and one co-op, of course, is living cooperative or a
Exactly.
housing cooperative. Yeah.
Yes.
So the connection with the community is the main difference.
Is the main difference, exactly. Because when we look at what actually, we formed a sort of type of interdependency between the CLT H-buurt, which is sort of like the neighborhood at large project, and the one co-op, which is like the living cooperative that is going to come out of that, in such a way that before you can even be a member of this one co-op, you have to be part of the CLT H-buurt in general. And through that, we also came up, we're still far, we have a long way to go, but already we've been able to develop some allocation procedures when we finally realized our building. And this allocation procedures always came back to the CLT as a whole. And so we are always, as an ALV, had to vote about these 8.
ALV?
As a community.
ALV in Dutch.
ALV,
So
yes.
algemene ledenvergadering, which means the meeting of the members. That's the best translation.
General Assembly.
General Assembly.
General
That would
Assembly.
be the,
Thank
yes,
you. Thank you.
Exactly.
Languages. Amazing. So how did you find them?
Yeah. Well, actually,
You did.
you come into the picture. Space and Matter is one of our consortium partners in the broader research of charging the commons. And not Martijn, but your wonderful colleague Marjolein was working with you, Rosamel, at the CLT H-buurt, and I joined her.
That's and shall we look at we have a video. We prepared a video.
Yeah, I think the video might be better a bit later.
Ah.
Yeah, just because...
Spoiler.
It's
I'm
your
sorry,
program.
just because
So
it really delves into the mechanics of the voting procedure that we
but
try.
at the same time, it really shows off the community. But let's wait
Yeah.
for that. Then we continue with that. So, but why is this a special way of doing it and
A special way of
of
doing
organizing these ways of living together?
at the CLT and
Yeah.
the H-buurt? Yeah, I think what's intriguing from a research perspective is that we have a situation where you have people making decisions on different levels. So you have the broader organization, the General Assembly meetings of the CLT. I'm also a member of the CLT. You could also be a member of the CLT because you support the cause of the CLT.
Exactly.
Huh.
Yeah.
So how can I become a member?
By joining us online. We have a form online that you just need to fill, and then you're accepted. You get a phone call to ask you about why exactly you want to join. We also give you a briefing about what we do and who we are. And if you're still interested, you go ahead in the process and by a fee of about 10 euros a year, you become a member and get to have a vote in General Assembly's meetings.
What kind of responsibility does that come with?
Participating in the meetings, making sure you are there, but also when it comes to matters that about community building in general, being very much active in it.
So you actually have to be a part of the community and not just from a broader different...
You can be from the outside, but you have to have an affinity to the community.
Yeah, and nestled within that larger CLT structure is the Woon Co-op, which is a separate group of people, also members of the CLT. And for our research, this is really interesting because you have people with decision-making power who are part of a larger organization, and then a smaller group who are making decisions about basically what will be their daily lives. And then you can ask the question, should those people have more voting power or a different kind of voting power than the people in the broader organization of the CLT? So this was for me as a researcher, when you get into deeper topics like the allocation of voting credits or different ways, which issues should be voted on and which shouldn't, it was a really ripe organizational structure to dive into.
It sounds quite complicated because why would you want to, if you're living in a living cooperative or a housing cooperative, why would you want to give voting power over your own living space to someone who does not live there? And how does that work? So where do you draw the line between those two groups?
Well, I think one of the most important areas in terms of the decisions that you guys have been making is also allocation procedures. So the broader CLT is voting on the allocation procedures that will be used for the allocation of the homes in the Woon Co-op. And what we saw from the initial votes, I won't talk about how you did that now, is that the outcome was basically using a point system where you say the stronger your ties are to the neighborhood, the longer you've lived here or that you've worked here or you volunteer in the neighborhood or you're a teacher in the neighborhood, the more points you have accrued in order to eventually live in the Woon Co-op. But that allocation process must be decided by the broader CLT because that's the way that the Community Land Trust is organized.
And why did you make that decision?
Well, I didn't make that
decision. Our community made that decision through a General Assembly's meeting. And we sort of have what we call, or what we realized earlier on, voting by consent. Type of thing, where it was actually first voting by resistance, where the most resistance that you have, you lift up your hands. The least resistance, you have put your two hands down. If you're not so sure, bring up one hand. But then people were like, oh, they're not so sure about resistance, so they wanted a voting by cheer.
So you changed it to a more positive way. And,
this is actually the photo that we used for this evening. You see her. The discussion about this.
Exactly. And so that's how our decision-making process started before we headed towards the pairwise. But I think another connection that I would like to make is the fact that in as much as the Woon Co-op has a connection with the broader CLT, it is still a different entity that can make decisions on its own. We're still in the process of really defining the lines as to what exactly the Woon Co-op can do totally different that doesn't have to come back to the CLT in general. But for example, in the making of the allocation process or the allocation criteria, after it was voted off by the AL, the General Assembly's meeting, we did have a group of about 8 individuals from the Woon Co-op who actually did what we call better diving into the actual criteria. And so what the General Assembly's meeting did was just listen to what this committee had in mind and either consent to it by chair, or if you don't agree to it, then you can't just say no, but have to come up with a better solution, which of course ended up being the fact that everybody agreed with the process and that we could move on with it.
So the difference is that while you're part of the Woon Co-op, living cooperative, you have like in a way you have a different part of a different structure as part of the larger CLT, and at the same time, of course, as part of the larger community, you also have in a way of you're perhaps the first person who people look at because you live there. You actually have the connection
exactly
in the strongest way possible.
Exactly.
So if I would participate, or perhaps at one point you have then 18 points or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, amazing. And yeah, continue. So the thing I don't fully understand yet is voting by cheering. It sounds amazing.
It is amazing.
Yeah, I would love to be there. I was like, ooh, happy, happy, happy. But at the same time, it can be complicated because when things get trickier, how do you manage that? How do you make sure that everybody's still on board?
So this voting by chair is mainly used for, I would say, the basic things. So for example, when it came to how to actually rank the 8 allocation procedures, we used something they call pairwise voting via this software Mentimeter.
Mentimeter. Oh, yeah, that's the
yes.
thing with your phone and you're gonna on screen.
Exactly.
You sit here.
So with this 8 criteria of allocation that we had, every single criteria was compared to every single one of them. And then through this, we were able to see which ones the general community at large voted high for, ranked higher, and which one was ranked the least, basically. And then through that, we were able to distribute points just as much as the general community voted. And that is in the future when we end up forming the actual allocation committee that is going to do the distribution of the house. That is the type of ranking they are going to follow to allocate the houses to the individuals.
Amazing. Shall we go to Martijn or would you like to video?
Let's go to Martijn.
Let's go to Martijn. Martijn Poel, as I said, you're a co-founder of the design studio Space and Matter, which is one of the groups known for Schoonschip, among other things. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
I would normally ask, like, how do you listen to the previous stories? But you already dove deep into this topic. So, how do you decide, or how do you advise people starting these kind of processes on how to decide which decision-making process they would start with? How do you come up with this?
Yeah, that's already quite a deep thought question, because we're trying to get the technicalities. I hope you're still on board with the differentiation, what the CLT is and what the housing co-op is, and then I can even add 2 or 3 more models to that list. I wished I would have made that model split on a slide. And actually, we are doing this professionally and trained as an architect. So we provide architectural services and design services for buildings to be built for people to reside in. And actually, over the course of the past 15 years, we started working with communities, so actually trying to build groups of future residents so we can interact with the future residents, which is not a normal thing for architects to do. And that's why we started building crowd building as an online platform to converge or congregate individuals who say, like, okay, I want to live together with a group of friends and friends of friends or like-minded or whatsoever. So have a look at crowdbuilding.nl. That gives you an idea what it is. It's a platform, it's an instrument. And then besides designing and congregating individuals to making strong collectives with a certain set of tools and decision-making power, we've also established common city development to help them along the lines of taking care of the development process, which is
common city development.
Yeah, it's also on the slide, which is a very intense trajectory of getting, well, a design on paper towards land acquisition, towards closing finance, towards contracting a contractor and getting it built. Well, and all this said in the course of 4 years, 5 years, and for Schoonschip, it took like 8 years. So we do multiple of these projects as professionals from different points of departure, points of different perspectives on the job. And what we like to do most is actually make those buildings work the best way imagined by the future residents themselves. So actually, we also consider ourselves the tool.
Yeah.
Which is not an answer to your question yet. So how do we actually advise people? I think if you certainly flip through, well, this is a small team. This is important, actually, because this is another why. So why would we do this? It's a very labor-intensive trajectory. First, build a group of individuals in trying to make it a collective. So the collective is strong enough to make those decisions. Because we strongly believe in the left graph and the donut economy or circular economy and the donut model of Kate Raworth, that if we are capable of establishing a social foundation, and that's the core of the left model, and respect ecological boundaries within both levels, and establishing a social foundation and realize residential projects within ecological boundaries, we can safeguard the planet for future generations, which is also a technical story I will not go into deeper, because then that's for another
reason
session.
to start living together or doing things a different way.
On the right side, you see a value flower. So what can we pay attention to and invest time or money in order to make that grow bigger? It could be ecological value, if that's of importance, or aesthetic value and architecture. We can increase economic value or cultural value or social value, and there's different trajectories to be chosen to eventually find an optimum for a certain group, to find, is it aesthetics or is it more the social value to be incorporated, or artist in residence, and so to represent cultural value, what have you. So these, and the left one is more on a mission statement, and the right one is one of the tools that helps us in a discourse of finding where this group wants to go. If you go to the next slide, and you can just flip through, then I'll explain a little bit. This is a realized project as one of the neighboring projects to the Warren. It's not a housing co-op. It is kind of a co-living project, but these people actually own their individual apartments, but they developed it collectively. So it's a small technical difference.
Yeah, so it's a collective opdrachtgeverschap, so it's a collective way of granting the project.
Collective commissioning. So working as a collective together, doing the development and the design and the decision making and even the funding to eventually realize individually owned apartments. And the Warren is collectively developed and designed to also be collectively owned. And actually the building owns itself, more or less, so for future generations to level out permanent affordability.
Yeah,
let's say. And then Schoonschip is an example project, and maybe one slide after this one. And so actually what we do as professionals, we try to develop the tools to help us make these kind of processes and decision-making processes simpler, more predictable, trying to get a grip on the fuzziness of it. And that's, of course, where we collaborate with Tara and the other researchers in the room. So we practice, they research, and they are actually case study owners or the real practitioners. So that's where we have a role in all this.
So if I, with a group of other people, want to start living together and try to create a new building, because housing in Western Europe, basically all over the world, is very expensive at the moment, and I want to really develop something for myself, I'll come to you, and then I know you because I believe in the donut economy as well, for example, and I want to add value in different ways. So you help groups like that make the right kind of decisions, how to create these communities.
Yeah.
And but take us along. So then I'll get back to my previous question, but I realized that I was going too fast with my question, because in the end, of course, you need to get to either the Schoonschip variant or the weiland variant, which is a grassland and at the same time asland in Dutch. So it's a joke in there. Or you can go to the CLT H-buurt, or you can go to the Warren, inderdaad, sorry. You can go to the Warren. So there's all different kind of choices. But when I come with you, with this group of people, I haven't made this decision yet. So how did you figure out, would you then figure out which group or which way of collaborating you would advise?
Well, I think it's finding out along the way, because I think you don't know what you don't know as soon as you start and feel attracted by it. And then I would say, well, if I'm listening to this or hearing about a project as Schoonschip or the Warren, you start looking out for it. And then crowdbuilding is one of those platforms. You can start joining groups that already got started. And as soon as the group grows, there's more momentum, and the group starts actually self-organizing. And if the group becomes strong enough, they really could increase their project potential. Eventually, it really becomes a project organization, and to be professionally organized. And that's where we step in and help facilitate decision-making processes, explain the difference between democratic decision-making or holacratic and the basis of consent decision-making. You can leave the decision-making up to us, but then it's just sit back, relax, and we'll design it for you, and there's different depth you can go into, and that was, I think, on the next slide. We have a zeggenschapsmatrix, and that's like a few fields, like either you want to be informed, Martijn, you make the decision, but keep me informed, or I want you to consult me, and then we make the decision together. Or Martijn, let us do the decision making. We'll let you know what came out of it, and you just execute as an architect or a developer.
Zeggenschap matrix is a compound word in Dutch. German is especially known for that, but Dutch is also quite good at it. But it means like who gets a say in the most literal sense in the matrix.
Subdivision of mandates.
Yeah. So, but in a sense, I try to grasp it. It's a complicated thing, but the way you explain it to me right now, it is actually quite simple. You start as a group. You share certain values. You ask for professionals who could help you or look at different experience from the past. And then you decide as a group what fits you best. So it's not that complicated in a sense.
Well, the group does not know what fits them best because the group does not exist yet. It's a collection of individuals. So it takes a bit of time before the group of individuals is actually considered a group. Yeah. And as professionals, we've seen multiple groups, and we recognize it by the time they start talking about we and us. Well, there's a sense of community. And in the first 2-3 meetings, it's like, I'm here because I'm interested in this and I want to live there and this is what my apartment should look like. After the course of a few months and a few more intense workshops, we decided the collective space should be like this and we want to live on the top floor because we want to be and that's all the me becomes the we words, and that's where they start actually thinking and acting like a group, and then they can get into the collective decision making.
Does it only work with new communities and new buildings? Or could it also work with existing buildings?
It could also work with existing buildings, but we are in the practice of realizing to be built buildings, and that's where we take pride and we see fun in doing it this way, and we develop it ourselves. Mm-hmm. I think most of it by intuition and thinking and reading, and then of course also onboarding with researchers and learning from other projects to continue learning what we already do.
I think part of grasping this is actually embracing the fuzziness.
Yeah.
I think when we hear the word decision-making processes or setting up an organization or a community, we think in this very traditional way of a contract and agreements. But what we actually see in practice is when you talk about choosing an issue that you feel close to, or the cheer putting your hand up and down, these are actually embodied experiences of decision-making and in some cases democracy. And I think it's a real shift in the perspective of how we have the tendency to look at decision-making processes as groups.
Yeah, because in a way, when you start these, perhaps that's also where my questions come from, but if you start with these kind of groups or with this kind of collaborations, of course, there is, as you said, there is an I in the beginning. So there is, you have a certain amount of fun, so you want to live. There's the first reason to do that, and you transport that to these kind of living experiences. So the fuzziness is also kind of scary, isn't it?
I think for different people, it means different things. I think some people feel really comfortable in that fuzziness, and those tend to be the people that get involved in these kinds of projects.
And I would say it's not fit for everyone. And we also see, a group grows and a certain attraction towards individuals, and eventually a group distills and is a collective, which already means there's also individuals that left out and have the sense that I want to be in control, and you have to actually let go of control and have the collective decide for you. And the collective is none of us, but it's all of us.
All of us together.
Yeah. Shall we look at the voting?
This would be a great moment to show the film.
I was hoping for that. Let's look. It's a journey to get there. The film is ready.
Yay. Okay, that's good.
We are all individuals and we have different preferences and different needs. But since we're talking about a communal setting, then we're going to have to find a way to make compromises if we're going to live together and to use certain things together. There wasn't a discussion before the vote.
I mean, I'm going to put some weight on some other issues.
Yeah, that's totally up to you. The most polarizing issue was opening the ground floor to the immediate surrounding community. I knew this would be a controversial issue.
Unless we say, okay, yes, only us in one co-op, we are the community, we don't have no business with other people outside of our community. And I don't think that really will give us the full benefits of being community. We become a bit isolated because we want to protect our territory.
And maybe we have a place where it is purposely for playing purposes, playing in the ground floor. Then we have to think through how can it be shared by the other people coming from the other side. So it also depends on how the place is designed.
I think I had to use up all my points. Where do I put this? So, I was very, very confused. And we had to add it so that if that other point which I was to give to the other will give an edge to something. Eventually, after I added it to the kitchen, I think it boosted the number there. So if I don't utilize it, then it will just be a waste. We will still have private ones. So the private one, like we have a private kitchen, and then there's another general one whereby maybe once in a while all of us will say we want to eat something, and we tell you to cook it for us.
I don't know why many people objected because it's a very good thing. Like you are saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Once in a while, as a community,
we come out and
go down,
share.
we come down, we share.
Yes.
Maybe after we harvested something from the
We ask our Auntie Helen to make what kind.
An advantage to us is that we can now zoom in into where we think these are places where we are going, where we might encounter possible frictions. And the earlier we bring it to the table and ask questions.
Wow, it looks like home. Looks quite amazing. So it's a way of voting, and this is the quadratic voting system, right? So it's, and the thing, the lady who said, I have to use up my votes, otherwise it will be a waste. It's like, that resonates with me, but also there wasn't a discussion before the vote. Why wasn't there a discussion before the vote?
I think what he was trying to say was a discussion amongst the people, that is those present for the voting, because that would kind of defeat the purposes of the votes and sort of skew votes towards a certain direction. What I think this did, however, was also open our eyes to certain things that we hadn't spoken about yet, which we had to make sure we discuss before moving further. Example is more about the communal use of things, because we all knew that we wanted to have communal kitchens, for example, or multi-purpose halls where we'll do a lot of communal things, but then about opening it that much up to the whole community yet had not been that much discussed. And so as a result of us not talking about it before voting, we realized that, okay, so there's a little bit of difference of opinion here. Yeah. How do we speak about it and then come up with something to move forward with?
And so sometimes it works to let really people like from themselves make a decision on themselves, and sometimes it's worth as a community to talk about it and really make a decision as a community. And so you have to decide when you do what. It is. It looks amazing.
Yeah, I can imagine it's good to take a couple steps back because we just saw a lot.
We did.
There's a slide in my slide deck where you see a lot of different kinds of objects. This one. So when we talk about the discussion before the vote, there was a discussion before the vote, but it was a different kind of discussion. What we did was we asked the members of the Woon Co-op to bring us things that they would be willing to share once they started living together.
I was wondering what we're looking at, but so these are the things they said would like to share.
These are about 10% of the things that they said they would like to share. I think we have about 100 photos, which really points to the willingness to share almost anything. And the outcome of that workshop was actually to zoom in on what we were talking about was not necessarily sharing material things, but actually sharing care. And that vote was to further investigate how care could be organized or incorporated into the design of the building. So the voting issues that you see scrolling by have to do with which spaces are most important to us in order to realize this shared underlying value of care and caring for each other. To go back to the slide about quadratic voting, maybe it's good just to understand a little bit how this works. So in a quadratic vote or decision-making process, every voter is allocated a certain number of credits. In this case, it was 99 credits. And those credits can be spread across a number of issues. Yeah. The reason why this was a really interesting experiment within the context of the commons is because one of the affordances of quadratic voting, if you just go a couple slides, maybe one more slide. Yeah. Oh, not that one. Is it aligns really well with the underlying principles of the commons in the sense that it mitigates the dominance of specific individuals or groups or agendas. So that's built into the mechanics of the quadratic vote. It actually emphasizes through the mechanics of the procedure compromise. And then you see these other two things which I mentioned earlier about allocation of credits, and that's basically about who has what influence in regard to what issues.
Yeah, so everybody gets a certain amount of votes, also the amount of credits. To put towards votes. The thing I don't understand is why is 1 credit worth 1 vote and 9 credits worth 3 votes?
These are the quadratic mathematics.
Ah.
So it's the square root.
Ah.
I mean,
but still, then it would be. But apparently, I'm not suitable for living in these communities because I'm thinking about what I would get the most out of it. But then people would say like lots of 1 credit, and then I get lots of 1 votes. But then it doesn't work that way, I'm sure.
Well, the underlying principle is that you're encouraged to spread your votes. You could theoretically put all your 99 credits on 1 issue, but then you water down your overall influence. So the system is designed to encourage compromise and spreading of influence and to really think about what are my actual passions here. Is collective childcare, for instance, so important to me that I'm going to put 99 votes on it, or do I also want to share a kitchen, or maybe mobility, whatever is on the agenda?
So my original thought was the good way of going forward. Make sure that you listen to all the different perspectives and make sure that you don't fully put on one thing.
Well, that's up to you in the end. I mean, in the end, you are an individual.
Of course. Was it complicated to explain it to the group how this works?
I don't think so. Tara did the explaining. But I think later on we had a meeting where, we did discuss this quadratic voting, and it didn't seem like it was difficult at all. I joined on Zoom that day because I couldn't be there in person, but I also went through the voting in itself. And to me, personally, I thought it was quite an understanding and positive thing, because later on, as you go down the list, you begin to realize, I think I used up as well all my votes quite earlier on. And then going down, I began to saw certain things that are also important to me. And so now I had to think, okay, so how do I take votes from here and then add it to that place? It starts to allow you to compare really all the different criteria that all are important to you, but really towards ranking it in such, I think, a better way than just saying yes or no, basically.
So how many questions were there?
There were 10 questions. In total, there were 10 questions.
So 10 questions, 99 credits.
Yeah, and this is actually a huge compliment, because I think what the hardest part was not explaining it necessarily, but making it.
Mm-hmm.
So like if you go to the next slide, you see Wesley, who's my amazing programmer, sitting in the front row, and I really struggling to design this interface. And when we became interested within the project in quadratic voting, we started to use some of the interfaces that were out there on GitHub, on Discord, and very quickly realized they were basically not usable in situ. So we canceled the workshop that we were doing with you, and we said, we do it after the summer. And Wesley and I spent a couple months really trying to figure out how to make this procedure accessible and somewhat user-friendly because of the complex mathematics on the back end.
Yeah, this I navigate towards, and if you say like complicated mathematics, and it's like
You don't really see that part here.
Well, I can understand that, but you lose me when you say it up, and when you show me this, I can understand how the system works.
Yeah, well, that's the point, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's what we do it for. What we discovered in the end is that in the analytics of the quadratic vote, you have really a plethora of granular information that we actually didn't and still don't totally understand how to apply. So you have the basic voting outcome, but you have all of these underlying bits of information about how people voted on different issues, how different people voted on different issues, how much yes. So we're still figuring out what could the community or a community professional do with that information as part of the community forming and moving forward into other decisions.
And would this be a model to use at, for example, should you use this model as well? Would it be a model that you would advise for more cooperatives to use? Or is it just, again, one way of doing it and another organization should have another way of doing it?
Well, it's definitely one part of a broader array of decision-making procedures. I don't know of so many projects that are testing quadratic voting in situ, so in the actual situation. So I can't really say objectively if I think it's good for a certain community or not. I think it's promising in the sense that it addresses some issues that I think are not only important for these communities or commenting communities, but some bigger issues that we see if we zoom out and we look at democratic processes like polarization, for instance. I think that on a broader level, communities and people are looking for ways to make decisions differently and make issue-based decisions differently. So like not a referendum, for instance. It's not a yes or a no. And this is one way to do that.
Amazing. Thank you for taking us along with all these different ways of doing this. It's, in a way, we have to embrace the fuzziness. I've learned that today. So different ways of looking at decision-making processes. We open up the floor now for the rest of the audience here in Pakhuis. People looking at home, next time, join us in Amsterdam. Join us in Pakhuis if you're here. You could also participate with this part. Volker is walking around with a microphone. If you have any questions, raise your hand. Later on in this part, you can ask a question. One main rule is Volker is keeping on to the microphone. That's very important. And it is nice if you introduce yourself beforehand. It's not necessary, but it's nice to get to know each other. And before we do that, one very basic question to why, in a sense, it's kind of not so nice to ask that, but why bother with all the complexities when with homeowners associations, one person, one vote works kind of nice a lot of the time. So it's also kind of difficult to explain it to people why they should work differently. So why bother?
I think, shall I answer
Yeah,
this question?
go.
Okay.
You
I
can
feel
all
like I've been
answer.
talking a lot.
And the audience can answer.
Yeah, I think what we see is a real desire for more nuanced information being carried into a decision or a decision-making moment, and more nuanced information coming out of the outcome of that decision-making moment.
So it increases the quality of the decision-making process in a sense.
Yeah, it provides an additional level of insight into the decision-making process, which can be really valuable for communities. From a technological perspective, there's new possibilities opening up. I mean, we have Web3 and decentralization. The idea of going to your local voting booth and picking up the red pencil. I mean, that's really changing. Now we have the possibility to vote on what could even be global agendas, to vote beyond borders or even geopolitical borders, and technology is making that all possible. So we start to see those shifts in these situations, I think, because they're sort of like microcosms of what could be possible for broader sections of society.
Yeah. And why do you think we should bother with this?
This is the means and the tools, technologies, and instruments to an end. And we do it to reach that end. And everything in the middle is something we have to crack and deal with and try to improve along the way. And the end is, and the goal is to build stronger social foundations, more social inclusion in our cities, because I believe we live in, hyper-individualized societies, and with our phones, and we can operate ourselves. We hardly talk in the streets because I can find my own way if I get lost, et cetera, et cetera. And that's also introducing a longing for belonging to social structures again. And you introduced in the beginning, like an hour ago, as if this is new. No, it's not. But I think society has lost track of what we've always done as human beings, as part of groups. So I think we're getting back to our roots by the use of instruments and decision-making, etc. And if you build a strong social foundation with a sense of social inclusion and not excluding people, but different people from different backgrounds, that will eventually establish a very, fruitful way of living together, because you want to be seen, you want to take care of others, which gives you a sense of, a sense of belonging. It makes you literally feel better, compared to the hyper-individualized way of living now. Just buy an apartment, find out who your neighbor is afterwards, and you go to neighborhood meetings, which are a pain in the ass, just once a year.
Exactly.
Which is not living together, is living next to each other with a 20-centimeter wall in between of you. And this topic is about really living together.
Really solving, it's a better way of solving complex problems and bringing people together, making community together.
For us, it's trying to increase happiness, people living better off, living together, as if it's a fairy tale. You know.
Absolutely.
That's a lovely fairy tale.
Absolutely.
Looking to the audience, are there any questions? Please raise your hand if you do. There's one person with the black shirt.
I was wondering, how do you measure if decision-making is actually improved by implementing such systems compared to just one vote, one person, one vote?
Ooh. Good question.
Yeah, I mean, if I can speak from lived experience, because we have the whole philosophical framework. But for example, if you have to make decisions with a group of people you're living with, you don't necessarily want a yes or no option or A or B option. What if the outcome is 55% is for, 45% is against? What is that going to do to your community, and how trusting you are of each other, and how much you feel connected to each other? So a very pragmatic reason to be like, okay, we're not going to go with voting, we don't vote at all in our community, is to say, okay, we need to build decision-making based on good discussion and on trusting that the person who puts forward a proposal is actually going to execute this with our values in mind. So I think it's very important to just try these things out, and from lived experience you'll notice what the outcomes are. And so far, for example, our holacratic way of deciding has been working for us. Yeah.
So to answer the question, the way you measure it is by the fact that you're happy together and the system works. Yeah. See, different other questions, but the thing my question that comes with that is that who comes with a proposal then? So someone has an idea and has like, well, I would like to do this. And then
you, so basically we have different circles, right? But let's take the biggest one, which is also the General Assembly. So all the members of the association. The idea of holacracy is you propose something coming from your role in the system.
Yeah.
So if you are, for example, the treasurer of the group, you can make proposals that have to do with finances.
Yes.
So last weekend we decided whether we're going to raise our own rents or not. Very important decision. So the proposal gets put forward with an explanation, and the next part, people can react to it, and then comes the objection round.
Yeah.
And so on one of the photos you saw us all with our thumbs up, that's not because we're voting, that's to show we don't have an objection. But if somebody would have an objection, they would maybe turn their thumbs down. We listen to those objections, and not with the goal of shooting down the proposal, but to try to integrate the objection into the proposal.
Yeah. So the person who manages finances is the person who could say, like, I'm going to raise the rent. And then the person who manages the gardening would say, well, we have to make the garden ready for the spring.
Yes. And we are not very strict on it. So if you want to propose something that doesn't come with your role, but it's a good idea anyways, we'll listen to you.
And the final question, we'll go to the audience. Who decides who gets what role?
Formally within holacracy, every circle has a circle lead. And this person gets to distribute the roles. But because it's usually more ground up, a person would step up to a role. Yeah. But sometimes, obviously, there's roles like maybe treasurer that aren't like very much valued, or not well valued for sure, but wanted by a lot, desired. So this is a point where maybe a circle lead would step up and say, hey, I think you would be great for this role. Could you please fill it? Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Let's go to the audience again. I saw some hands over there. Please raise them again. The person on the second row and then the person on the third row. So the one with the grey sweater. Let's look from here.
Okay, I don't touch it. Okay. So I feel like many questions that raise is coming from this indeed hyper-individualistic perspective. Many of the concerns or like, the uncomfort with the uncertainty is coming from there. So what I'm really curious about is how different cultural backgrounds or perspectives that people have in these commons affect the process from your experience. Because I know, for example, being not from such an individualistic upbringing myself, I know I grew up with the saying of, for example, buy a neighbor, not a house. So it feels super like intuitive to me, some of the decision-making processes. So how does that play out in your experience in building these communities?
Amazing.
Well, I think
very good questions.
Every individual has an influence. So cultural backgrounds definitely have an influence because eventually it's about establishing common ground and common interests and trying to find where do our overlaps and actually common ground exists and where do we have differentiating views, which can also exist or coexist or sometimes come to the table and conflict, and then we can still discuss about it. So it's always different and it's always enriching and not excluding.
Tara, would you like to answer that, or?
Yeah, I was thinking of Rosemary because
I was thinking
you have a really
about
good answer for this question.
Maybe not a really good answer, but for example, with H-buurt, we have so many different cultures within. I remember an example was when we were actually planning what we wanted the layout of the apartment to be like. And people were looking at open kitchens, and other people were like, no, but I cook this type of food, and it wouldn't be nice if I have a visitor over and they smell this type of thing. And somebody's like, oh, but when you have an open kitchen and you have somebody visiting you, for example, it sort of leaves conversation. You can have conversation whilst you're in the kitchen and so on. And so obviously these were people who had sort of been living in the Netherlands for a very long time and are used to that. And these are, when you move to the other sessions, like people, I'm originally from Ghana. And when it comes to our local food, for example, it can be quite fragrant, that you wouldn't want to get into people's clothes. So you have to think about, maybe I would like a closed type of kitchen. And so it brings into perspective respecting everybody's culture. It brings into perspective listening to everybody and considering what everybody has to say. Then you think about it in the concept of kitchen. Do we want to go about in a way where we do all the apartments in the same layout? Or do we want to consider the fact that we all have different cultures, so we'd like to consider it in building the apartments, where we have maybe different layouts that would benefit each and everyone? Or do you think that this is something that you can compromise on for the betterment of the whole community at large? And I think that is one thing that moves everyone, because we have that one commonality, is that we want to make sure that it benefits the whole community. And so if I have to relax or I have to relent on this particular issue and it's not going to harm me that much, then it's not going to be a problem, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with it. If I do disagree with it, however, I have to make sure that I bring up something that is way much better, and that everybody can also sort of say that, not have that much of a resistance against, so that in the end, the goal is, okay, let's move forward. How do we move forward with this? Respecting everybody as a large, please.
Well, that's a good way of working together. The thing, I listen to the question also in a different way, is I'm very Dutch. Sorry for that, I am. My parents, my parents didn't have the saying of you buy a neighbor. Neighbors were a chore for us in the past. It's like, okay, you have to talk to the neighbors. You have to make sure that everybody's happy with each other, but rather not. Like build a fence as high as possible and keep them out. So from my perspective, of course, I ask these kind of questions because that is my upbringing. So how does it change when your perspective is like further in the community, to connect with the community. Is that a main difference?
I need to get into this question a bit. I'm thinking back to some of the conversations we had leading up to developing the questions for the quadratic vote. And some of those conversations were about compound houses in Ghana. And what I found really inspiring about those conversations was, of course, it's kind of obvious that you all live around a central plane because you can share that as a resource. But what I didn't know is that part of the architectural arrangement is that you can see your neighbor. So if somebody might perhaps need something, they don't have to ask you. You can just see that they need it.
Yeah.
And this aligned for me so well with the goals of other common communities that we were speaking to, and at the same time was an integral part of the architectural realization of the house. I think a detail like that is really invaluable. It's also why I included in the vote, which led to a whole other conversation about kinship and if we could use this same terminology in a more Western context. But these are kind of little, like, at least for me as a researcher, gems that arrive during working with communities that I don't know so well and asking these kinds of questions. And they are specific to communities and to culture.
Of course, yeah. So perhaps my inability in the beginning to fully grasp the concept comes then from a cultural perspective, and you have to push people to get out of your own frame and look at different ways of kinship, different ways of community, different ways of working up. You're a bit glassy.
I would say you have to start experiencing a bit.
Exactly.
And it doesn't need to mean that you move into a communal housing or anything, but you could organize an event together and give everyone a role in the organization, and it already gives you that sense of lived community.
Amazing. Did it answer your question? Perfect. Then the person on the front row, which is
hi.
Martijn de Waal.
I'm Martijn. I'm also part of the research team. So actually, I wanted to answer your question. You said why bother, right? We have one person, one vote. That works really well.
Which is a horrendous question. I know.
So why do this? I wanted to add some extra complexity to that, because I think what we're actually talking about here is that collective decision making is much more than voting, right? Voting is yes or no. But collective decision making is really taking the time to understand how people feel about a particular issue or what they think or what the controversies are in a group. For example, what I really like about the quadratic voting, and we're still figuring out whether it's actually a tool to make decisions or more like a polling tool, right? Because you get a number of credits and you can divide them among a number of things that you would like or not like in the building. You can vote positive, but you can also vote negative. Against something, right? And that allows you as a moderator that if you look at the statistics, you can really see, okay, the communal kitchen, we have 5 people who really put a lot of votes against and 5 people who really put a lot of votes in favor of it. So that means, oh, this is really a contested issue. So this is the one that we should discuss more and more and more about before we take the vote, right? Whereas others, it might be more divided. So I think what these tools do is add a lot of complexity and granularity that allow you to have better decisions or better discussions before you put it to a vote.
But also sense that it brings a lot of clarity in where the community is at the point and where decisions are going, or where you need to take more time to walk through certain decisions.
Well, that was one of the interesting findings when we did the quadratic vote. Is at the moment that you call something a vote, it becomes very serious.
Yeah.
So there were many discussions about these topics. There weren't necessarily leading to concrete outcomes. I'm not really suggesting that what we did here led to concrete outcomes, that it wasn't really the point. But at the moment that you have to really take a stance on something, it does clarify your position. And from a clarified position, you can take a next step that tends to be more productive.
Yeah. Sounds amazing. There's another question. The person with the orange sweater. Oh, I didn't see it.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Michiel Schwartz. I want to follow up some of the points that Martijn made in response to your question. If you look at the VVA, Association of House Owners or Apartment Together, sort of like works okay. Why bother? I want to add to that. In relation to 2 things. One, in the title it says Design for Collective decision making. I don't know much about collective decision making. I do know a little bit more about design. It's very interesting that design, if we see collective decision making as a design process, and that was seen at the beginning, especially in relation to the commons, I think this is a very significant thing that came right in the beginning of the evening, but then was lost. That when we talk about commons, people say, well, we have common resources, but what's really crucial in the commons and collectives is also common values. So that I think it's helpful to think a little bit more about what it means to have values up front, that the collective has certain values and they're taken aboard. It's a way of looking, and certain things they aspire. Some people talk about purpose, and that's built in the collective. And that's completely different from a VVE vergadering, where it's decisions about functions, it's about what we should actually do, rather than taking aboard that the decisions are also about how to keep the collective values together, the aspirations of the people, the kind of living they want to do there. And that's sort of unsaid. And I think that's like the most crucial difference between traditional decision-making, where it assumes that we have a decision-making process, and once we have that in place, like all the technical things we have, and then we have values we put on top of that. And we each have our individual values, and then we have a decision-making process. But with commons, and I think collective decision-making, the idea that we have collective values and we want to treasure those and advance it comes almost before your process of decision-making, and that's really fundamental.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing. Thank you. Yeah, it's a good clarification. And of course, not all, but a lot of people, and we've been making a lot of programs on how, for example, homeowners associations can be more sustainable, or can make their buildings more sustainable. And most of the time, this seems to be quite horrific process to get through, because all people have different opinions. And yeah, so thank you for the clarification. There's a question over there.
Yeah, hello. I was wondering how to deal with like veto situations when someone strongly disagrees with something and it really is a non-negotiable, but they also don't know a better solution. Like, should they not be able to voice their veto then if they don't know a better solution, or like how would that be dealt with?
And start with, I would like to hear the answer from both of you, because in your situation you don't vote, so people have to come up with a proposal, and you can have you have questions or doubts on the topic, but you can't really vote, and you can't then also not.
No, there's no vetoes. There's no vetoes in this system, but there are objections that really count. So the question that comes with every holacratic decision is, does this cause damage to the process that we're continuing with? And that's actually quite a hard conversation to have if somebody feels very strongly about it. Also because somebody, especially if it's something that, you experience in your daily life, you don't necessarily have all the words for it. So the question, does this damage, it is a good question, because it puts the focus back on the bigger community and not on what your personal problem is. But I think it's very important to have these other methods of discussing the emotional layers. So we've had difficult discussions. Fortunately, it wasn't one person versus everyone else, not that strongly, but maybe a group of people really wants to throw bigger parties, and another group of people is more like, well, I want my kids to sleep well, and I don't think it's good to have music after 2 or whatever. That is a real topic, yes.
2 o'clock, 2 p.m. or 2 a.m.
Then we're going to have to find different ways to discuss this. So we have also implemented different methods, like deep democracy, for example, where you really fill out a room with everyone involved, and you really see like, okay, well, who stands with who on the topic, and can we sort of find common ground, but also can we get that voice that is sort of hidden by maybe the people that have the loudest voices.
So almost literally like the line game. So if you agree with that, you go to that side of the room and the other side to the other.
Yeah, it's similar.
Deep democracy.
Yeah, it's similar. It's called a conversation on your feet. So you make a stance, and people that agree with you can take a step towards you, and you have this very dynamic exploration. But we've also employed methods where it's really more the talking stick type of method. Like everybody gets to speak, nobody else reacts, you just listen to each other. And we do find that if you have these sort of very good conversations, usually your personal views or experiences or you know, they get pushed back a bit, and it can be again more about what's good for the bigger group. And more about how we can trust each other.
And then because everything is very much trust based, but then in a practical sense, where you have a strong objection, that almost sounds like a veto. So what is in a practical sense then the difference between a veto and a strong objection is that with a strong objection, at least you still open to discussion and open to measure the differences.
It's more like, let's go back to the drawing table. This is not what the group wants, because there's a strong objection, and it's you know, well argumented. We'll try again next time, I would say. So it's good to table some discussions for later sometimes.
I'll go to the group, unless you have something to add to this.
It's a question, I think, building on to it.
Okay. Then I'll first look at Rosamel, at how it works in your community.
How it works.
Do you have vetoes in your community?
No, actually.
So you have, if you don't agree with something, you have to come up with something better.
You just have to, and I feel like when you don't, it sort of, how do I put it? Puts less work on everybody. Because, and people go through a lot of processes to come up with decisions. And we come up with the understanding that it's very disheartening and to just tell somebody, no, I don't agree.
Yeah.
When they've put in so much work to make up a decision. So maybe it's just an aspect that you don't agree with. So what aspects of it do you not agree with? Because we also have the thing of going back to the drawing board. For example, with the allocation committee, when we came up with certain things and the rankings and so on, and we came back to the ALV, to discuss this, we had, I wouldn't say objections, but a few questions. It wasn't necessarily a strong objection, but maybe I'm not so sure why this should have more points as compared to this. And then when people normally say that, they also have a reason why they believe in that. For example, they feel that maybe, just want to give a typical example, that maybe somebody has moved out of the community, but they had lived 10 years in the community and maybe are not getting as much vote as somebody who's been living there in three years. And that's a very laudable reason, because they spent a lot of time in the community, even though they may have moved out, working in the community and contributing to the community. But that's something a small group of people did not consider. And so with regards to that, we go back to the drawing table, that, okay, we're going to think about this and come back to you in the next meeting about how we can make it better. So with us, there's always, there's never a definitive answer that you cannot bring an objection and you have to stop there. But we are always open to, let's go back to the drawing board, as he said. Unfortunately or fortunately, we're not living together yet. I feel like once we start living together, more of these things are going to come up. We've not had a case of such a very strong objection before. So I may not be that much of an expert in dealing with that. But so far, what we have been doing works for us. But I'm excited to see what comes when we start living together.
Thank you so much. Let's go to the person in the back with the amazing green sweater.
Thanks. Yeah, I have a question. I think you earlier in the discussion mentioned like the idea of collective care also. Also, I can imagine it being quite intimate. So how do you make sure it's always like a safe space to talk? I'm curious for the like practical things you do for that.
This was really, this was a main issue in the quadratic vote that we held. To what extent, actually I should zoom in on the question. The question is, should young people in the Woon Co-op care for older people? It was an idea that was introduced in previous workshops and discussions. And what happened then is that the definition of this care became extremely important before there could be another round of decision making about whether we wanted that, yes or no. And this is maybe one of the pitfalls that we're also looking at now within our research about quadratic voting and also other kinds of plural voting that present questions, is what do we mean when we use certain kinds of terminology? When you say care and when I say care, are we talking about the same thing? So I think that has to be established before you can even have these deeper conversations about, you know, what is too intimate for you or what is too intimate for you, but are we speaking the same language with each other? That's something we haven't solved yet.
So it's still a way. I like the focus over there. Sorry, I can't change that. But I like the pictures with all the blenders and washing machines and the things you would like to share.
Yeah.
But it's also a very cultural thing of what you perceive as sharing and perceive as caring and perceive as living together and where do you draw the border. It's quite amazing. So perhaps we have to make a different evening about that and how we can discourage that. There's a question over there and over there. Oh, choose one. Of course, yeah. We have to be fair.
I have a question about scaling possibilities. So it seems like this works particularly well with like relatively small groups. So like, you know, a house or a neighborhood. Is there a sense in which these collective decision-making processes break down when the group becomes too large, or can you envision this working on a far larger scale?
I was hoping for this question.
Yeah, you were hinting at this while saying that you can like. Also beyond the borders.
Yeah, well, I think this is one of the kind of great promises of something like quadratic or any decentralized form of voting, right? Is that we can supersede all kinds of geographical boundaries. So that's the scalability question, in my opinion. I don't have an answer for this, but I do see really interesting experiments. One of them that we've been following quite closely is in Taiwan with Polis, which is a discussion forum for citizens. There's even been some experimentation in Groningen, I think, in the Netherlands with this, where basically there's a digital platform where citizens can react to political agendas before a vote. And after everybody has participated on that platform, what they do is they throw an algorithm over the top of it. And more importantly, what that algorithm does is it searches for commonality. So if you talk about scalability, I think the scalability is in how we approach the information. So looking for commonality and building on that commonality moving forward rather than specifically fishing out the friction points and blowing them up, which I think is what's happening in politics now. Whether it will work, I have no idea, but I think it's promising.
Perhaps we should also, another topic to make a different evening about, but at the same time, it's if you talk about if it's difficult in a community to define, for example, caring for each other, then of course that would be very difficult to do in a larger scale. But at the same time, the same structures work on both scales, so it could be possible to do it on a larger scale, like cantons in Switzerland.
I don't know about that one. I think like the big one on the table at the moment is can we decide, and I'm really in a speculative realm here, right? Like, could we decide as a hemisphere, for instance, about the future of the climate? Like, could we actually set up a climate agenda that supersedes local politics or geopolitical borders? I mean, theoretically, with something like decentralized voting, you could do that. I think with an issue like climate, we're probably speaking more of a similar language than when we zoom into something like care in a very local community.
I'm hoping with you. So let's look forward. There's a question over there, and there was a question over there.
Yeah, you had the same question about scalability as me.
Oh.
So, but another thing I was wondering, like, what kind of people join these communities? Like, some are just there. I imagine in the H-buurt, but the Waren is probably like very much a decision to come there. But how would you reflect upon this? Like, if you implement these kind of systems, like in a sport club or like in an educational system, or how? But because it's like not really mainstream, it's like against the stream even. What's your reflection on that?
I don't know. I think specifically what we have done just works for us. It makes a better understanding because almost every person in the one co-op has something we have in common, and that is just a community. Most of us have lived in the community or worked in the community for so long that, for example, it's not easy for us to just throw away ideas that we think are going to be in the betterment of the community. We love the community so much, And I think you said something about the fact that trusting, that's the person who is coming up with the decision, has the, what is it called? Has the thoughts of the individuals at hand. We trust you enough to know that this you're not going to do anything against that because of something we have so much in common with and something we hold that much. So I would believe that in every single different type of corporation, in a sports corporation will be something that is totally different. Maybe this type of voting of ours is not something that would really go with them, but with the quadratic voting at least, since I participated in that, it allows us to look at the pros and cons. You don't just look at the positive sides, but you can also disagree with something. At the same time, it allows you to see in the larger view that, with this community, even though we've been speaking that much about things, when you put it into numbers, you can easily see that this is something that we're really passionate about. And this is something that is very much different, or there's like a sort of friction about. So how do we move across this friction? Because we want this project to exist and we want to push toward this project. So how do we make sure that this friction becomes something that we can move past at least? So I believe in every different corporation, it will be different, and systems will just have to adapt to the corporation that it's being used in.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, it's nice to talk a little bit about our history, because we are actually a community before this project started. And a much bigger community at that, because this group sort of flowed from a collective called Konijn, rabbit in English. We're called the Warren, which is rabbit housing. It's like the holes under the ground. And that group has been around for more than 10 years, organizing New Year's parties, festivals together, whole trips to Portugal and Croatia. And I think these people find each other because they love these spaces of freedom and creating together. So through, friends of friends of friends, you'd wind up maybe at one of these festivals and experience whether it was something for you. So the first time I visited one of these festivals, I really experienced a sort of immediate connection that made me feel like, okay, this is a community I want to be a part of. I met my partner there. She was the one who was already busy with this housing project and talked me into it. But for a long time, I also felt like this is not really something. I felt a lot like you, I guess, like very Dutch, and I need to be in my individual apartment and have everything to myself and feel like I own what I have. And then through engaging more, I realized like, okay, well, there's such a beautiful mix in actually having your apartment, but also sharing so much space together. So I think it's that common sort of, those common values, as a gentleman called it, this common feeling of basically belonging, feeling at home somewhere. I think that's the core of what community is. So if you really feel like you belong at the sports club, probably you're going to want to invest a lot of your time working for it. And whatever type of decision making you use, as long as it fits your values and how you want to decide together, I think it'll work. Yeah.
Thank you. There's room for 2 more questions, and it's up to Volker to decide who.
Hi, I have a twofold question about the core values, or defining your core values. So on the one hand, I wonder about the practical process itself, because I imagine it as like a longer discussion, listening a lot, also changing, adapting. But then is there a moment when you sit down and write those down, or is it kind of more flexible? And then on the other hand, what happens if you feel like there's a member of the group who's continuously disrespecting, quite a strong word, but disrespecting those values, and how do you go about it then?
Yeah, it's especially with you, because you don't do voting, everything is in trust. But how do you cope with that?
Yeah, so the values were written down. It was a process that started with a small group of people who actually did a lot of work to think of, what type of project do we want to be? What type of community do we want to be? And obviously, they strongly based their ideas of what we already experienced building festivals. So a lot of it was already there, but it did need to be discussed and written down. So we do have that sort of core document that is our values, and it is nice to look at sometimes, but it's not something we, hang on our walls and say, well, these are our values.
You're not a church.
No, it's not the Ten Commandments for us, but I do like thinking about them because, for example, one of them is being pragmatic, which I think is very interesting because you don't see that as a value a lot, but it really works for us because we are the type of people that don't like to talk about things endlessly and then see where it leads us, but we want to create, we want to do, we want to make. And I think that's why, for example, a system like holacracy works for us because it's very much focused on shortening discussions and going into the action phase. And when somebody really doesn't fit within this system of values, you start noticing it, especially living in a community. When somebody doesn't come to work, you might be like, okay, well, we're not really in touch with where this person is in their lives. But if you live together, you notice like, oh, this person is really not participating a lot. This person is not cooking for the group, or we never see this person at a members meeting. And then that becomes a discussion. And we've also, one of the decisions we made last weekend is the de-escalation ladder, we call it. And that has to do with what steps do we take if we notice that somebody is really not aligned with our values. And obviously that starts one-on-one, because maybe it's something that you witness and you want to discuss with the person, but it can end up being a group discussion or a discussion with a mediator or, yeah.
So you are part of the community, and you have, of course, you also added value to the community in a sense. So as long as everything goes well, so if the community has a responsibility to make sure that everybody stays part of the community within these values and make sure that everybody is happy and participates.
That's a community care, I would say, yeah.
And so it's also a obligation by every member to actually work for the opportunity, for the community in that sense. It works the same for you.
That's the hope, actually. At least we had to write certain things down because we had to provide a vision for the gemeente. And so we have
for the city council.
Yes. Yeah. So, of course, certain values are already stated in it. And one of the things that we consider during the allocation process is before finally you are, eventually when we get a house and before you are added to actually live there, you have to, especially if you're from the outside, you have to have at least work with us for about 3 months to see if you actually fit within the core of the one co-op, that is, and can exist within the one co-op, because we have a lot of shared living things, and not everybody is okay with that. So we have distribution of works, and not everybody is okay with that. We have, in the future, we plan on people taking hours out of their normal day to be able to help in the maintenance of their houses in various aspects. And if you're somebody who is not really willing to do that, you cannot coexist, basically. And so we do have a trial period before we believe we would allow somebody to enter into the one co-op with us.
That makes sense. The final question of the night goes to you.
Big responsibility. I hope it's not too naive, because I'm new to these concepts, especially quadratic vote. But we've talked a lot about common core values, but of course some more peripheral values can also change. We're human, people can shift. So my question is, how do you address internal politics or lobbying in these communities? Because maybe when maybe a group starts wanting to party after 2 a.m. and what if these people start trying to shift votes in a system that allows for voting? So I'm wondering if these systems consider these possibilities and what they do to address these scenarios.
Well, I think in the case of quadratic voting, this is really at the core of the voting mechanics. So the thing that it accomplishes best is actually mitigating this factional control with what we would refer to as the tyranny of the majority. A lot would have to happen within a quadratic vote to actually throw influence so strongly to one topic, because the design and the programming just doesn't allow for it. So that's actually one affordance of choosing something like quadratic voting. That's not true for all collective decision-making procedures, and it's not a perfect solution, but it is one way to deal with individual agendas or group agendas on the table that can become problematic for the group.
So that's why you have so if you want to add 3 votes, you have to get in 9 credits. That makes sure that the tyranny of the majority, which is like the majority 1.5 plus 1 decides what's going on, and the rest can screw themselves. So that won't happen because you have this system in place to really push it, make it very hard to create this system.
The chances that it will happen are less.
Yeah.
Still
possible, but you need far more to push that way. Last words?
Maybe a final comment. I think you were also tapping into that, or it made me remind of that by you asking the question. Like, this is 2 groups establishing themselves. Of course, if you're interested in this topic and want to find out what kind of groups is out there, then please have a look at crowdbuilding.nl. And that's like the nurturing space for individual initiatives that want to attract people. Like, join me. There's mission statements. There's already groups looking for people to join, and then, of course, find common ground, whether you fit or not, and go through a trial period. It's up to all the groups themselves how they want to allow people in. And it's actually it's a platform which is growing to facilitate this, well, let's say, bottom-up process of people taking control of their own living environments to eventually live happily ever after.
Thank you so much, because that in the end is, of course, the goal of society, to work together and to live together in a happy way. Crowdbuilding.nl.
Yep.
Let's all go there after, of course, this session. Thank you for all your insights and taking us, and in this case me, along on this journey to discover all the different ways of working together. I think lots of things to talk about in the future and lots of ways to discuss about it. For other ways, there's a slide with all partners and ways of sharing the tool. Of course, partners like Space and Matter, Stipo, De Warren, Metabolic, Dark Matter Labs, VAG Future Labs, and all others are part in this broader collection, of course. In the next episode, we'll talk about platforms and how digital technologies can support these platforms. Perhaps we can plug the tool once more, like the quadratic voting. I think there was a slide.
Yeah, it's on the bottom of one of the slides. It's if you want to try it at home, please do. It's quadratic-commons.org. Sorry, .org. It's here on the bottom of the right.
Quadratic-commons.org.
Yeah. And it's not mobile ready, but it will work on any other of your devices.
Okay, don't go there on your mobile phone. And the thing I like about it today is that we discovered all ways of doing this and looking at working together. And it's you don't have to dive in head first, fully immerse yourself in new ways of decision making. You can start slowly and try to discover how you can work together and how you can share responsibilities and discussions, right?
Sure.
Hopefully. Thank you so much. Tomorrow we're going to have a discussion here in Dutch about commons and car sharing. It's another way. Of course, we continue the discussion, but unfortunately only in Dutch. And the next episode, of course, is, as I said, about the technological part of it. I would like to thank all people participating in this, the audience and the people at home, and love to see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.